Welcome back, America. A little Coldplay for you because that's one of the songs referenced in Vectors, Heroes, Villains, and Heartbreak on the bridge of the U.S. Navy by my guest, Thomas Modly. Tom, welcome. It's great to have you back, Mr. Secretary. Where do I find you this morning?
Thanks, Hugh. I'm down in Sarasota, Florida.
Okay, wonderful to have you. I got the book in the reader copy, so it's a little unwieldy, so I made my notes on one page. The book is now available at Amazon, though, Vectors, and you know the lunch rule is if you want a book to be sold, you got to say Vectors 7 times. So Let's keep saying Vectors. I just talked to Admiral Stavridis about the Ford class, and I really glommed onto the details of procurement in your book. And your book takes us inside the Ford procurement, your conversations with Donald Trump about it, the christening of the Kennedy, the plans for the Enterprise, and the Dory Miller. Do you think we're going to stop at 4, Secretary?
Well, I think we're going to. I think that something's going to happen differently after 4. I'm not sure what that number 5 is going to be. One of the things that I tried to do when I was there was we did this 2 carrier buy for the Ford and the Enterprise, which saved us about $5 billion on the combined advanced procurement for a lot of material for those ships. And in addition to that cost savings, it bought us about 7 years before we had to make a decision on what the next ship in that class or some future class was going to be. So I formed a task force to take a look at that, and former Senator Warner, may he rest in peace, decided to chair that for me. And I had former Secretary Lehman on there and several other people who were very well versed in these topics. And I gave them the mission to, I said, hey, this is a blank sheet of paper. I'm not giving you any preconceived ideas of what needs to happen, but we need to think about what that next generation should be. And I tasked them with doing that. Unfortunately, as I also write about in my book, there's this thing that I call the organizational slinky, and that is you have to pull on the front of that slinky to keep the organization moving. Otherwise, once you let go or you're gone, it'll snap back. And so almost immediately after I left in 2020, they disbanded that task force. So frankly, I don't really know what they're doing right now to take a look at what might replace the Ford.
Well, the biggest failure of the Trump years was in getting anywhere near to 355 or even getting a plan. You were one of the advocates, along with Ambassador O'Brien, for getting to 355, having a plan and sticking to it. Secretary Esper was not so sure. President Trump was mad about the Ford most of the time. Why? That is the greatest failure of the Trump administration. Why do you think he campaigned on it, he re-articulated it at the Philadelphia shipyard, he did it again and again and again, and yet we were no more closer to it at the end than we were at the beginning? To what do you put that? In Vectors, you write a great deal about you are how you buy, and I think that is a very good summary of our acquisition system. But what is the root cause here?
Well, I mean, there's so many causes of this. I mean, there's a political reason. The few times that we've actually had an opportunity to grow the fleet quickly, it's because you had presidential leadership and congressional leadership and leadership from the Secretariat that really pushed it. And, in my formative years in the Navy as a young officer, that was when John Lehman was Secretary of the Navy, and he was given very strong leadership and guidance from President Reagan to grow the fleet to 600 ships. That growth was about maybe 15% increase in the size of the fleet back then. The 355 from where we were at 275 when I came in, that was like a 35% growth in the fleet. And so I think that it was not very well understood by people what that really meant. I think the people that did understand it decided not to be candid about what it was going to take, and for a variety of reasons. But in order to grow the fleet by 30 to 35%, you're talking about growing the Navy's top line budget by at least that. And so the budget was just not there for that. It was never there for that. And I tried to really push for it. And I think with Secretary Esper, I think he wanted to do a far more deep analytical look at actually what that mix would look like. I was satisfied that it doesn't really matter at that point in time. We were at about 300 ships. We needed to get to 350. That's a North Star. Let's start giving the signals to industry so that we can start building the capacity to do this. Because frankly, you can't. It's not a faucet you can turn on and off. We don't have necessarily the industrial capacity to get there. So to me, it didn't matter. You could say 350, 400, whatever. You need to start moving out on that. And I think we wasted.
Yeah, plan after plan after plan doesn't matter. Your great success is the frigate that's going to roll off the line up in Wisconsin, and we need those frigates, and we need a lot of those frigates. What else is a success as opposed to the LCS, and the cost overruns on the fort. What other success beside the frigate do you point to?
Well, I think we try to really open people's eyes to the sense of urgency. I think some of the stuff that sort of happens behind the scenes, I call these the gray zone areas in terms of business management, financial management, the ability to understand how we're spending money, and then I think, frankly, the whole organization of the information management functions of the department were pretty critical. We were finally able to bring in a top CIO from the private sector to help organize some of those things. And I heard your interview with Admiral Stavridis, and this is a big concern in terms of how I think the Navy, how far behind the Navy and Marine Corps are in the whole digital modernization efforts. Our networks are not great, and we really needed to step that up. And so those types of things happen behind the scenes. You don't notice them, but they're going to be critical to the backbone of the future Navy.
You do write about in Vectors, the China challenge. I'm going to come back to that. But as I mentioned, Admiral Stab, I want to thank you for alerting me. I was not aware of the uptick in Russian submarine activity in the North Sea. Now, I'm very glad that Finland is joining NATO today, and I hope Sweden is not far behind. But are they any good? Does their Russian fleet match the performance of the Russian army in Ukraine?
Well, it's hard to know. They're not at battle, so it's difficult to measure that. But I think with respect to their ability to perform operations and to perform operations that we may or may not be aware of, I think they're pretty good. I think it's a capability of theirs that has not really atrophied as perhaps we're seeing with the Army in battle. But you never know. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, this all comes down to how people perform in battle. And it's going to be difficult. It's one of the things about the Chinese Navy is that they've expanded substantially in the number of ships they have, but they really haven't been tested. They haven't really been at war at sea, and so it's going to be difficult to know. And I hope it's a question we never have to answer, but it's hard to really know how they're going to perform.
I'm going to come back to that in a moment, Mr. Secretary. I want to talk to you for a moment about the CMO. And the CMO came up with the number $40 billion of waste. And when I read that, and you talk about how Mr. Carney's number had an impact throughout the Pentagon, throughout Congress, is that real? Is there $40 billion of waste in the DoD budget?
Well, it depends on how you define waste. I think there is clearly $40 billion and more that we shouldn't be spending on certain things. But to define it as waste or things that can be sort of winnowed down through more efficient operations, I think that's a pipe dream. I don't know that that's possible. And I think a lot of that was just numbers that were thrown out there that weren't really analyzed deeply. And as we started digging into it more, we realized that they weren't real. So do I think that there are $40 billion worth of things that the department does that they don't necessarily need to do? Yes, absolutely. I think that's true. Whether that can be classified as waste, I'm not sure that's true.
Now, Tom Modley, you entered the United States Naval Academy in 1979, your class of 83. You served 7 years, and then you went to Harvard Business School. How much did the HBS experience impact your ability to go into the E-ring and get things done? You entered in the first year of the Trump administration, 2017. You left in 2020. In between, what mattered more, having been a plebe all the way through a fourth-year man, and your 7 years on active duty, or your HBS time?
Oh, I think I would have to say that those times at the academy were the most formative experiences of my life, for sure. But you build on those, you learn things, and you build on those as you grow. So I think in totality, everything sort of contributed to it. Not just my time on active duty, and my time on active duty was, during the Cold War. We were in a very different set of circumstances when I came back into the department 35 years later. But everything that I did in between, having the opportunity to be in the private sector, to learn about finance and business, and really understand how the private sector works, as well as having spent some time over in Iraq and Afghanistan working on economic development missions and understanding how political decisions have direct impact on people's lives, particularly our sailors and Marines. All those things came together to help me have a frame of reference that was, I think, valuable to me when I was both the under and the acting.
Mr. Secretary, let's talk about you are how you buy. Because complexity in procurement. You talk about the Ford trying to add too many new systems onto the Ford at once, adding to the complexity. What is the answer to that? Because we obviously need more and ever increasingly advanced weaponry, but we can't forever be building the next best thing.
No, I agree, and I think I agree. I definitely agree with Admiral Stavridis on this. I think we have to move towards more rapid development of smaller, lighter, more agile, more nimble platforms that don't tie up as much capital. Because as I don't know if Admiral mentioned this, but when the Ford was first developed, we were looking at it costing about $9 billion. It's coming in at about $13 billion. And we're just concentrating more and more and more firepower and cost and people on these on a smaller number of platforms. And I think we have to go the opposite direction. I think we have to be able to experiment. We have to become comfortable with autonomous vessels that are basically things that we throw out there, and if we lose them, it's not such a big deal. And so I see that shift moving in that direction to sort of lower cost per platform. When I was in the Navy during the Reagan buildup, the average cost of a Navy ship during that buildup was $1 billion in real dollars. When I was there back again 35 years later, and we were trying to build towards a 300 plus ship Navy, it was $2 billion, and that's in real dollars. So you can see what's happened is we've concentrated a lot more cost and a lot more expense and firepower on a smaller number of platforms, and I think that just increases our risk.
Now, Mr. Secretary, I'm very curious about the culture of senior decision makers at Pentagon. I have been since McNamara tried to turn it into the whiz kids. Did the senior leadership of the Trump Pentagon sit down and think strategically, or did they react to the day's events? Did anyone ever sit around and say, what do we need for our Navy? Should we go to a dyad as opposed to a triad? All, the big questions. Does anyone do that anymore?
I suspect that those questions are being held. I would say that a lot of the meetings, and I talk about this in my book, more of the meetings that I was involved in were involved in trivia than they were with the big questions. And that's unfortunate, but it's what drives the agenda in the Pentagon. We're constantly responding to congressional inquiries and trying to keep optics under control and those types of things. And so we end up getting sucked into to situations that don't necessarily grapple with the big questions. I think I give Secretary Esper some credit in terms of his decision to do a serious study of the Navy force structure, but I just didn't think it was necessary at that point. We had been looking at it for years, and he had some challenges with the National Security Advisor with respect to whose responsibility it was to drive that. And I think there was a lot of political intrigue involved in that whole scenario. And I was just trying to stay out of that. I just wanted to get the Navy on a course towards a better future and a bigger, more agile future.
Now let's turn to pages 242 to 243 and beyond, which is on the threat posed by China. I spent a lot of time talking about this, Mr. Secretary. And the Chinese naval buildup has been the most expensive in history. They put more money into more ships more quickly than even we did at any time during the Lehman buildup. I think probably World War II, we spent more doing that in GDP terms. What are they building? I mean, what is it that Americans ought to understand about what the Chinese are doing right now on the seas?
Well, they're building everything. They're building corvettes for coastal defense. They're building destroyers, they're building frigates, they're building aircraft carriers and submarines, and they're building small helicopter carriers like we have, amphib assault ships that carry helicopters. They're building everything. And more important than what they're building is that the result of what they're building is an incredible industrial capacity. That is the thing that worries me more than anything, is their ability to flex that industrial capacity up. It's staggering, and it's something that we don't have anymore. I think we're down to 7 shipyards now that can actually produce. And probably one of the most significant parts of our overall fleet structure is the submarine force. And we need to be building at least 2 to 3 of those a year, but we can only crank out about 1.5 right now.
Our mutual friend, Captain
challenge.
Hendricks, has a piece in The Atlantic this month on ceding control of the seas. Did you have a chance to read that yet?
Yes, of course.
And do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with Jerry on a lot of things. I think he really understands I think he understands the strategic context that we're in, and I think he he's very astute about this issue about industrial capacity, because as I mentioned before, it's not just a light switch you can flip on. And we just not when you start atrophying this skill, you lose the skill sets. We have a lot of people who are very technical welders who are now reaching retirement age. They haven't brought the next generation along. And so we've got some real challenges with respect to how we rebuild that. So even if we said, for example, if I said, all right, if everyone decides and the president says, we're going to build a 500 ship Navy or a 350 ship Navy, and we start today, it's going to take a long, long time to build that capacity to actually do that. And then once you have it in place, you have to sustain it, you have to maintain it. And frankly, the biggest cost of sustaining and maintaining this fleet is people. And that's the other point that I think as we start looking, and this is the another significant, I think, reason why we have to move towards more unmanned or lightly manned type vessels, because just the cost of people, and plus just from humanitarian perspective, why put people at risk when they don't have to be at risk? And so I think we have the technology now to be able to do that, and it's something that we have to start developing.
I'm talking with former Undersecretary and Acting Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Modly, and I want to continue talking now about John Lehman. There's been one great successful Secretary of the Navy in my lifetime, John Lehman. And why did he succeed where other people have tried but not come up to the mark that they set for themselves?
Well, there's a couple things. I think one was preparation. I think when he came into the department, he had a very strong understanding of what needed to be done. He had worked on the Hill. So that was one. Secondly, he had, because of where he came from on the Hill, he had senior Senate approval and acceptance and advocacy for what he was trying to do. And it was clear that the chairmen of the Appropriation Committee and the Armed Services Committee were behind this plan. And so the money was going to flow. But the most important thing, without question, was the fact that he had a president who, when the Pentagon does its normal thing and tries to protect different pieces of the pie in the budget process, President Reagan made it very clear. Does anyone not understand that we're building a 600-ship Navy? And that was the thing that really helped Secretary Lehman drive through that.
What happened to all those shipyards? The question is, what happened to the ships? We know where they are. They're in the Ghost Fleet, or they've been sunk or sold off. But what happened to the shipyards that built the 600 ships?
Well, as you know, Hugh, after the Iron Curtain came down in Eastern Europe, and we went through this grappling with this term of a peace dividend, there was a massive consolidation in the defense industry. And through that consolidation, most of those shipyards were just shut down because there just wasn't the demand to continue to build them. So they're very expensive to operate and maintain, and so they basically disappeared.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about the culture of the Navy, civilian side management. Is it the same as the culture of the Army civilian side management, the same as the Air Force civilian side management, Space Force, and Coast Guard? Or are they uniquely dysfunctional in their own ways?
Well, that's a hard question to answer without being pejorative. I don't know if they're uniquely dysfunctional. I think there are cultures in all three of them. Having not spent time with the Army or the Air Force, it's hard for me to judge that. But these are bureaucracies, and they grow. And I talk about the great self-siloing organization. It's when you have an organization that big, they self-silo, and they come up with their own identities. And ultimately, what ends up happening, whether consciously or subconsciously, is that people seek to protect that identity and that community. And, so for example, I think you're going to see if there is a serious movement towards unmanned naval aviation, you're going to have a revolt, I think, from career naval aviators who don't want to see that happen, and retired naval aviators that don't want to see that happen. So, change is very hard in an organization like that. It happened when we went from battleships to aircraft carriers. I suspect this next generation of change in the Navy, it's going to experience the same type of thing. So this is just natural.
Let's close by talking about, I would give vectors to everyone on the transition team for the next Republican president. And I would do so because it would tell me what I needed and what I didn't need at the Pentagon senior level. If you were on the transition team for the next incoming Republican president and that president was committed to reclaiming the presence on the seas necessary to guarantee freedom of the seas. That's not CCP specific. That's not Russia specific. That's the free seas specific. What qualities would you look for the Department of Defense, from SecDef to SecNav to SecArmy, Sec Air Force? Who would you look for in terms of skill sets to staff up the next Republican Pentagon?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think you have to have someone who truly understands the geostrategic context. It's a very complex geostrategic context, and although we've been sort of heads down on this war on terror for 20 years, in the meantime, the world continues to percolate, and our adversaries continue to grow and get more aggressive. And so I think someone who truly understands that is critical. But I also think if you're thinking about a Secretary of Defense, I just believe you need someone who's very, very experienced in executive management at the highest levels, who understands organizational change and understands what needs to be done to do that. But that being said, Hugh, I think it's a challenge because of the high level of political turnover we have. Even in fairly stable administrations, people leave, people get promoted. I was thinking about Admiral Gilday, who we chose to be the CNO in 2019. I believe he's had 6 bosses since then.
Wow.
And when that boss is supposed to be the senior executive in the department, driving a $230 billion enterprise with 1 million people in it, and that boss is changing, and that boss has different ideas every time, because the types of service secretaries and secretaries of defense you have in a Democrat administration are very different. Their priorities are different. My classmate is now the Secretary of the Navy. He has very different priorities than I had when I was Secretary of the Navy. So to some degree, I don't blame the admirals for saying, okay, well, yeah, we'll listen to this guy, but he's going to be gone soon. I think that they really have to seriously rethink how we do this, how we do the executive management in the departments. And I'm suggesting this, I'm not recommending this, but they may want to look at something more along the lines of what they do with the FBI, where the service secretaries who are responsible for driving this change, and it has to be sustained change over an extended period of time, you give them a 10-year fixed term, and you let them build their team, their civilian team, to come in and drive that type of change, particularly when you're looking at a big rudder change, which I think we're probably need to be looking at for the Navy.
Well, big rudder change. Let's focus on that. What do you mean by big rudder change?
Well, I think this shift to a more distributed fleet is a significant change in how the Navy is going to have to operate in the future. And I think the concept of being in more places at once is also a big point of it. I think Jerry makes this point in his article, where we have 300 ships. They say maybe 100 of them are deployable at any time, but in reality, there's probably 60 of them out there at any one given time. That's a lot of ocean to try and cover with that small amount of ships. And so what it does is it strains the force, it strains the ships themselves, and it strains the force, it strains the people, and it's not sustainable. So I think that type of, thinking differently about the future and how we create this more agile and distributed force is going to be critical. And it's not something that you can just say, okay, one secretary comes in and in 2 years he says, this is what we're going to do, and then it's all of a sudden going to happen. There needs to be some sustained leadership to drive that through. And I can see maybe turning the Secretary of Defense over every time administration changes, but I think there needs to be more continuity of services, because that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the budgets get executed. That's
what I agree. By the way, the FBI director serves a term of up to 10 years. So does the Archivist of the United States. They can be removed for cause. But the key is continuity and plan. Because I've been covering this for 23 years, Mr. Secretary, and they've had more changes there than the Browns have changed quarterbacks. You have the blessing of being a Cleveland Browns fan, and you know what I'm talking about. You can't develop a program if you have that change over and over again. And so if anything comes out of vectors, I hope it is the consideration that chaos simply is going to be there whenever you have a political system that substitutes people in. What do we have? 4 SecDefs and 6 SecNavs. It's crazy.
Right. You can't sustain anything. I mean, like I said, I used to write these vectors to the fleet every week to try and give them the sense of my priorities. I did that for 19 weeks, then I was gone, and then I don't know, my successor can do what he wants to do. and have different priorities. And then his successor can have different priorities. In the meantime, the Navy still needs to be out there doing its mission. And so I think that's why when you asked that question earlier about what's the focus at the Pentagon, it is mostly about, the day-to-day and managing the day-to-day rather than sort of the big picture things, at least from my perspective where I was sitting. I'm sure that kind of thinking is happening there, but day-to-day and where I look at my time and my calendar, it was much more about exigent things than it was about strategic things.
Well, there are some things you can't avoid. You covered the shooting at Pensacola. You covered the shooting at Pearl Harbor. It's a very important that you deal with the crisis at hand. Of course, you cover the Midway. Everything is in vectors. I encourage everyone to go to Amazon. Secretary Modly's last name is spelled Modly. Don't put an E in there or you won't find it on Amazon. You have to put Modly. Go Browns, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining me, and congratulations on Vectors.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.